First presenter, as I mentioned earlier, is Frank Romo from the University of Michigan. He's going to present the work that he and Lacey Sigmund, who is not in attendance, did on measuring access to basic services in unincorporated Los Angeles.
I'm from Los Angeles, California. I'm a student at the University of Michigan, Masters of Urban Planning program, and today we'll be looking at measuring access in unincorporated neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So the County of Los Angeles, within the County of Los Angeles, there are smaller cities and there are also unincorporated neighborhoods. Unincorporated neighborhoods must rely on the county's services, so they must rely on the county sheriff's department, must rely on all of the services that they are provided are not provided by the city because they are unincorporated. So that kind of brought us to our first research question. I have a background in community organizing, and this is kind of where this came from, because I know that in some of the areas that I've worked in, there were unincorporated neighborhoods, and because they were unincorporated, these neighborhoods suffered a little bit more from access to basic services, access to healthy food, those types of issues, a wide range of issues. So this is we have a
second. Here's a laser pointer, the second button.
There we go. Here we go. This is Westmont, Los Angeles, and this is an article from the LA Times highlighting that in Westmont, Los Angeles, which is an unincorporated neighborhood, this is called, they coined it Death Alley. So here, along this stretch of about 2 miles, they experienced the highest amount of violent crime, homicides, within all of LA County. And so this has been a really big problem for a few years now, and we started to think, well, why is this occurring? What are the geographic issues that play into creating a neighborhood that suffers from these types of issues? So this is a quote from one of the community organizers there, who was talking about the lack of access to basic services. He said, "It's amazing that an area with such high need is so underserved." And being from Los Angeles and doing my work in Los Angeles, I find this very often, where there are neighborhoods that are in very high need of access to better jobs, access to better food, access to better healthcare services, those types of things. And oftentimes these are the areas that are most underserved, and it has a lot to do with the sprawling nature of Los Angeles and how things are very spread out, and if you don't have access to a vehicle, you can be very isolated, and these communities become kind of like islands in themselves. And because they are unincorporated, that kind of compounds that fact that they are islands and not being serviced by other city services and things like that. So just to give us some context, the two areas that we looked at were Westmont, as I pointed out, and Lenox. Westmont, here are some statistics. Westmont we found because we found out that it had one of the highest murder rates per capita in LA County. So by using that as a baseline, we were looking at all their unincorporated areas, searched all through LA County to find other unincorporated areas with some similar statistics. Lenox has a lot less crimes over the course of 6 months, and also per capita had a lower crime rate. So we thought comparing these two was a good idea, especially because majority of the population is minority neighborhoods. But as you can see with the amount of square miles, total population, a few household income as well, some of these things are very close in nature. So we thought there would be two comparable areas that we can look at. And this outline right here is the city of Los Angeles. So a few other areas right here are other cities, but as you can see, they're kind of just carved out of the city of Los Angeles and kind of stand on their own. And another thing to point out is that both of them are kind of surrounded by freeways. Again, going with this idea of geographic isolation and how the freeways, the lack of access to services, how these things all play out for these people who live in these neighborhoods. So our methodology was looking at measuring access. We measured access in 3 ways. We were looking at access to jobs, access to public services like EMS, police services, and fire services, and the third thing we looked at was access to public schools. So the first one we were looking at was using a 30-minute commute time, which is the average commute time for residents in LA County, and we looked at both access to jobs by car and by rail, because both of these neighborhoods are buttressed on the bottom by this right here. This is a freeway, but it's also a light rail line that runs in the middle of the freeway. So that was the rail line that they would have access to. So we used half-mile buffers from the rail stops to kind of see what the general service area is. Then we used network analysts to kind of find out how far residents in each of these communities could get using a 30-minute commute time. And so here's basic, we looked at the block groups, and as you can see, the block groups in Westmont, they're very, this is using a 30-minute, a half-mile buffer around the station using network analysts, so the street networks. Westmont is not very much serviced. There's only a few census blocks that are serviced by the light rail, and in Lenox there are substantially more. So we're going to get a little bit deeper into it now. Using a 30-minute commute time, we then took all of the jobs, all the businesses within LA County. We went by zip code and just mapped all of the businesses and used that to find out how far people could get within 30 minutes and how much access they would have. So wherever you see this light orange, that is where people would be able to access based on how far they've traveled. So if I live in Lenox and I want to get to this stop, these are the jobs that I would have access to within a 30-minute time, and that's using the rail line and then walking distance. And so as you can see, as you move down the rail line, here's where the majority of jobs are. So there are jobs closer to the Westmont area, but then we also looked at jobs also within the community. So as you get further along the line, obviously there are less access to jobs, because as you move further along the line, you're running out of time. And so we understand that that is not the best way to approach it, but again, using a 30-minute commute time, we figured how far can people get, and using only one mode of transit. So that was another thing that we didn't incorporate, was multimodal transit. So that is with Lenox neighborhood. As you can see with the Westmont neighborhood, it's a little bit different. There's a lot more jobs within the Westmont neighborhood and a few scattered around here, but again, you have a little bit of the same effect. As you get further out, there's less and less jobs. So this is using access by car, and this is again using a 30-minute commute time, and 30-minute commute time. The blue area is the Westmont service area, and the pink area is the Lenox service area. For this one, we saw that Westmont ended up having a larger service area because of its access to freeways. And again, that's making a big assumption that residents in the community have access to a personal vehicle. So that's why we're really focused on the rail a little bit more than the vehicle, because because residents in these communities are lower income, they might not have as much of a disposable income, which means they might not have access to a personal vehicle. So Westmont was significantly larger, but that was just because of its access to multiple freeways. And so here's the breakdown. The total number of blocks that had access to the rail was greater in Lenox, with serving about 5,000 people, whereas Westmont only served about 1,200 people of the residents in the neighborhood. And then if we look at the number of companies that were within each, this is pretty close, but then if we look at the total number of companies accessible by car, we see that Westmont is significantly larger. Not too much of a difference, but I think the number one thing that we were focusing on is this statistic right here, is how many people had access to the rail line and how far could they get using that 30-minute commute time. So the second thing we looked at was safety services. So as I said before, that is EMS, police services, and fire stations. And so we use a national standard, so 6-minute response time for police, 6-minute for fire department, and 4-minute EMS because of a life-saving situation. Because we were looking at neighborhoods with higher levels of violent crime, we thought we took this one into account very seriously, because we know that EMS has to respond rather quickly if there are severe injuries from gunshot wounds or things like that. And so here is the response time of the police stations. And again, these are usually in the city of Los Angeles, you would have a police station within the city, but because these neighborhoods are unincorporated, they are dependent on the LA County Sheriff's Department. So here's the County Sheriff's Department, and here is one. And as you can see, Westmont is significantly serviced by this one, but that had only happened recently. In about 2012, I would say, this sheriff's station relocated to that point. And we didn't go into the research too much of why, but we kind of had a hunch that that was because they knew that there were some problems in this area that needed to be addressed that were not being serviced. So this was actually recently opened, like I said, in 2012, and so now Westmont is significantly more serviced by the LA Sheriff's Department, whereas Lenox, only one block group is serviced by the Sheriff's Department. Oh, actually, excuse me, we spoke 0, because we used, in order to determine how they were serviced, we looked at the centroid. If a centroid was covered by the service area, then we considered it to be service. So again, if you look at here, the centroid is not covered by the service area, so 0% of the people in Lenox were serviced by the Sheriff's Department based on that response time, the standard response time that we used. For EMS services, we looked at all the local hospitals, and so as you can see, they're kind of scattered around. There's one, Lenox is serviced pretty closely by one, so it's not too far away. But again, Westmont, here again, I want to point out again, Death Alley, where that first slide was, is right along the edge of Westmont. As you can see, there's not any hospitals nearby, and the service area for these hospitals in a 4-minute response time is not very significant. And even when we doubled this, I didn't include the slide, but even when we doubled it to an 8-minute response time, Westmont was barely covered by the corner of one of this hospital zone. So this is something that was really significant because we saw that Westmont had a higher level of violent crimes, but did not receive a lot of EMS support based on the national standard of 4-minute response time. And so even in Lenox, only 3 of the block groups were serviced, which was about 26%. And then again, I think looking, for me, this number was the most important, looking at actually how many people had that access. And then fire stations was the most equitable. You can see there are 3 fire stations, one in the middle of Lenox, one in between both of the neighborhoods, and one right in the middle of Westmont. So even using the 6-minute response time, a small piece of Westmont is still not serviced, but for the most part, this was the one that was most, I would say most equitable, because everybody was pretty much serviced. 15 of the 15 block groups were serviced in Lenox, and 20 out of the 22 in Westmont were serviced. So that brings us to the last one, and this was measuring average distance from the centroid to the nearest school. And we looked at public schools, elementary school, middle school, and high school. And again, that's making the assumption we have 6 schools here. But one of the things I would like to point out is that, as we'll see in the next slide, the elementary schools are pretty well distributed and things aren't too difficult for students to get around. But as we move to the middle schools, we start to see a little bit of a change. Here in Lenox, this is the only middle school that is serviced, so residents on this side of the neighborhood obviously have a longer time to get to the neighborhood. And even more so for Westmont, we have the middle school over here, so residents down here will take obviously a lot longer to get to the middle school, and that might have an effect on how students can get to school every day and how they can get to and from school. And again, thinking about if this is a neighborhood or certain parts of the neighborhood that are a little more dangerous, how do students feel when they're traversing these areas? And the last thing was high schools. So did this intentionally. Lenox does not have a high school within its district, so its high schools are either down here in Hawthorne or all the way up here in Inglewood. And that was something that was really interesting that I was not expecting to find, because the only schools within Lenox area are charter schools, and so that was a little outside of our scope, so we were just focused on the public schools. And because Lenox didn't have access to a public high school in their neighborhood, all their students have to leave the neighborhood significantly, at least more than a mile, to get to the nearest high school. And then so again, that brings into account ideas of access to public transportation, access to a personal vehicle, and also the time spent traveling. Whereas here we have a high school located in the middle of Westmont, but again, these census block groups at the northern end, again, will take longer to get to the high school. So here's the average distance based on this average distance for each based on the block group size. So we weighted it based on the block group size and how many residents were in each block group. So as you can see, the high school for the average distance to get to the high school from Lenox was 1.5 miles and about a mile from high schools in Westmont. But for elementary and middle schools, well, at least for the middle school, it was significantly higher to get to the average distance it took to get to the schools. And so here's just a breakdown of the access, and we looked at which neighborhood had better access. It was kind of a toss-up. There depends what you are most interested in. Again, going back to my own experience of organizing, it depends on who you're speaking to, right? If you're speaking to parents, then this is going to be probably one of the things that is most important. If you're speaking to people who have suffered from violence in their neighborhood and have had friends or family members suffer from violence, then these few things right here, police and EMS services, are going to be most important. So it was kind of a toss-up. There was a little bit of both, and that's to be expected. And my next steps is really evaluating the quality of the services. Wasn't able to get to it. We have some of the data, and that is the next step, is to push and see the availability of jobs by sector, and also to evaluate the number of jobs, because again, if I'm in a low-income neighborhood, it's good to have access to jobs, but are those good-paying jobs? Are those jobs that are going to allow me to ensure that I can put food on the table and earn a living wage? And so that's the next step, is to look at the availability of jobs by sector, also evaluating the quality of the high school, and then also evaluating the API score of the schools, because I know more than one of those schools in Westmont was technically a school that was not doing so well. I don't want to say failing, but it was a school that was not performing to the highest quality that it could be. And so that's something that we're also looking at. Just because that is a school that you need to go to, what is the school doing for you if it is a school that is not servicing the children properly? And then looking at other services, access to sanitation services, polling places, things like that. Again, just trying to gauge the community's access and also their voice within the larger discussion, because they are kind of islands, as I said, because they're separated by the freeways, but also because they're unincorporated. They're kind of left there out there on their own and are serviced by county services, which also service many other neighborhoods. And one of the other next steps is looking at other unincorporated neighborhoods in Los Angeles, applying the same model and seeing what happens when we apply the same model to other neighborhoods in LA County. So thank you very much for your time.
You did a wonderful job on presenting your information. You did some nice analysis. I do have one question. Can you give me some more information on a conclusion of how these factors impacted crime itself? Because you do a lot of analysis, a lot of good analysis on fire service, police service, how far it is to a job, access to rail, access to cars. But can you give me a little more information on pulling it together as a conclusion, how they interact and how they do impact crime?
That is something that my partner and I kind of went back and forth on, and I'm not willing to say that there's like a correlation there or any type of impact on crime necessarily. That's kind of how was our starting point in looking at the process and kind of getting into the research. And I honestly couldn't say how that has affected it dramatically. I know that moving the LA County Sheriff's Department station closer to Westmont has had an impact. And that's anecdotal. That's personally because I know people from the neighborhood, and I know because I used to do organizing in the region. So like I know some of those things, but as far as like correlation and how much of an impact it has had on crime, that is not something that I can answer yet, but it's something that is also looking at next steps. However, one of the things that I'm more focused on is how unincorporated neighborhoods act, are run, and are serviced, or what it looks like every day for people who live in unincorporated neighborhoods. So that's kind of the angle that I was coming at it from more so, and I don't think that I'm not willing to make that jump to say that it has a correlation or that has had that much of an impact on the amount of crime.
Are you going to continue to study it? Or?
Yes, I am, and I think if you have a suggestion about what type of measurements that should entail, then I would be very open to hearing that and having that discussion.
Very nice.
I just have a comment. I noticed that when you put up the demographics, that the two communities are somewhat similar in the percentage of minorities, but there is dissimilarity in terms of what minorities you're looking at. I was just mapping crime for Detroit, and looking at a number of the different crime categories, Southwest Detroit really stood out as being different from the rest of the city. And of course in Southwest Detroit, there's a lot of Hispanics, So there's something going on that is, I don't know, I was starting to look at some demographics, some other variables, family makeup, extended families, and those kinds of things, just as a thought for why you might be seeing some of those differences between those.
And I think one of the things that, again, going back to all the way back to this first slide. One of the things that was evident from this community organizer standpoint was that in the article he also goes on to say that, you know, he's an organizer now because he had engaged in some of the activities that had caused the community harm. And I think in South Los Angeles, again, I step very carefully because that is my family is from East LA, but Los Angeles is my home, so I step very carefully, and I don't want to say that there is a history of gang violence there and that is carried over and that's all problematic, and I don't want to paint that rhetoric. But at the same time, there have been issues in the past in areas around here with gang violence and things of that sort that can still carry over to today, and that's not the only thing, and so I don't want to paint it that way, but that is something that is prevalent in certain communities, which can lead to a higher violent crime rate.
All right, great, thanks, Frank. I think we're gonna move on to the next one here. Just go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, I think I heard you say early on that unincorporated neighborhoods rely on counties for their services. In Michigan, there's an additional level, in addition to cities and counties, there's a township level of government that offers services. Is there no such analogous thing in
No.
California?
You have the county and the cities that are within the county, and if you're not incorporated, then you rely on the LA County Sheriff's Department and the county services for your. And these are neighborhoods that are spread throughout the county. So the LA County Sheriff's Department, there are stations here and there, but they kind of have a list of neighborhoods that they have to service.
So even though Michigan has these township levels of government that do offer services, one of the things right now that they're looking at is to consolidate services across townships because of cost concerns mainly. So based on what you know about California and maybe the lack of services because of having no townships, but considering Michigan possibly going to that model or something like that by eliminating levels of township, what would you recommend for Michigan as far as maintaining level of township services or not?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I think the problem with the unincorporated neighborhoods sometimes is, like I said, there's a list of neighborhoods that the county has to service, and I think, me personally, there can sometimes be biases to police some areas more heavily and biases to police some areas less, and so that's something that is a little bit more difficult to quantify, but it's something that kind of goes into the whole discussion about how violence occurring and how does violence continue to happen when there's a county sheriff's department a few miles away, but our neighborhoods are taking how long to get a response time?
I had a quick question, just one quick question. Did you compare your data to any other community with a lower crime rates? For instance, you were talking about the distance to middle school and high school. There's a lot of communities where in neighborhoods where people have to go further for those things, and I was just wondering if you made that comparison at all.
No, we chose Lenox because it was significantly lower crime rate than Westmont, and so we were using those two to compare each other.
Okay.
But moving forward, we'll be looking at other unincorporated neighborhoods, and they kind of fall on a range. Thank you very much.